Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Fitzgerald and I'm going to be talking to you in this presentation about today's news content and how it is interpreted by journalists and the importance of being media literate when assessing information from the news. The main question that we will be exploring in this presentation is whether the news is an accurate reflection of reality or if it is a constructed view created by journalists. As the audience, we expect authentic stories from all over the world, but is that what we're really getting when we watch the news or read the paper? The most obvious difference between entertainment programs and news programs is that the news reflects information from real life and entertainment TV is created for some sort of entertainment purpose. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. At the surface level, these two types of programs seem distinctly different, but in actuality, the news is just a journalist's interpretation of a real-life event, heavily influenced by network demands, making it oddly similar to entertainment programs. The information and published stories that are selected for public viewing are heavily influenced by three unavoidable constraints. The textbook, Media Literacy by James Potter, states that the three unavoidable constraints that journalists face are deadlines, geographical focus, and resource limitations. Deadlines pose a serious problem to the validity of the news because deadlines force journalists to publish a story that can't be accurately completed before the deadline because the events are still ongoing. This causes the journalists to publish a partial story, which doesn't have all the facts, or they can wait to publish the entire story until the event is completed in its entirety, which is frowned upon in the public eye because it's considered old news by the time it's published. The second unavoidable constraint is geographical focus, which plays a huge part in explaining why local stories are much more prevalent in our news programs and newspapers here in America than events happening in a less industrialized region. A study demonstrated by Kim and Barnett in 1996 found that the flow of information around the world is dominated by the Western industrialized countries at the center. This means that the more economic power a country has, the more likely that an event happening in that country will be covered instead of the same event happening in a poorer country. This flow of information found by Kim and Barnett holds true on a much smaller scale here in the United States. For example, events happening in major cities in the United States are much more likely to receive news coverage than the same event happening in a little town in Ohio. Ultimately, economic power determines if an event is newsworthy. The third unavoidable constraint comes in the form of resource limitations. Resource limitations affect how many journalists are assigned to cover an event and why certain news programs and newspaper articles are cut to save space. Journalists face physical limitations to how long a story can be, either because of limited space during a TV program or limited space in the newspaper. This type of constraint affects how a coverage of an event is presented to the public because it forces the journalist to leave out important information just in order to make the story length fit. News networks pose these constraints on journalists, yet they repeat the same stories several times throughout the day instead of exposing the audience to more news stories on their networks. Even though resource limitations adversely influence the journalists, many news networks have been consistently making more money every year that could be used to eliminate some of these resource limitations. Another way that the demands of the media shape the way news is presented comes in the form of commercialism and marketing, or in other words, the news networks are continually moving towards a business environment to make as much money as possible. They do this by doing whatever it takes to meet the demands of the advertisers that pay a lot of money to advertise their products on their networks. Let's discuss this more in detail. Commercialism has one of the strongest influences on shaping the news. News networks need money to function, and they get a majority of this money by finding advertisers that want to pay the network to include an advertisement on their homepage or in their physical newspaper. Advertisers only want to pay to advertise on news networks that are generating a lot of hits from viewers at home. This drive to make money forces news networks to publish stories that will bring a lot of viewers to their network. This is where major issues can rise because news networks begin to publish more entertainment news and other forms of soft news. This is just one reason why stories are getting shorter and shorter, and it seems that you can't visit any major news site without seeing an article about a Kardashian. Soft news generates more hits online instead of a published story that covers a controversial but important world event that could possibly offend viewers to the point where they won't come back to the news network anymore. Some stories aren't covered because they will conflict with the demands of the advertisers who are big investors to the network. The increasing amount of news networks that publish stories not solely for the purpose of informing people, but rather for attracting large audiences to make more money, makes the news networks heavily rooted in commercialism, which is dangerous for something that is supposed to reflect real-life events because that means there's an agenda being pushed. Another influence on the way the news is shaped can be found through operating conventions. Operating conventions concern how expert sources are chosen to interpret news events, how cultural values shape a published story, and how the use of dated story formulas are still popular today. Expert sources on a news network aren't always chosen because of their expertise on a specific topic. Expert sources are sometimes chosen just because they have good surface validity, which basically means that they don't always have the necessary credentials to interpret these world events, but their ability to tell a good story that matches with the values of the news network is what makes them an expert. Sometimes, journalists become used to these network favorite experts and repeatedly go back to them for their expert opinion instead of branching out to new experts. This keeps the network sources continually unbalanced and incestuous, which greatly influences how the news is presented. Hyperlocalism is something that we are actively seeing today in the news world. News networks are making more money by creating niche publications and shows than trying to attract a mass audience for just one show at a time. The problem that arises with hyperlocalism in the news world is that the audience is only exposed to the things that they are already interested in, allowing them to typically not challenge their views on things they don't know about. The media's demand for quick news is what keeps the dated story formulas popular in news stories today. Story formulas such as the inverted pyramid are used today to grab the attention of passive viewers. The inverted pyramid is a writing formula that puts all the important information in the first few sentences of the article, so that way readers don't have to invest a lot of time to get the information they want. Unfortunately, inverted pyramids usually focus only on surface information and typically only share information from one side of the story. These types of stories are popular in the media, but they are dangerous to the news world because they lack balance and adequate information to important events to create informed opinions. Overall, we have learned that the news is not an accurate reflection of real-life events. Total objectivity in writing stories is nearly impossible for journalists to sustain when they are influenced by unavoidable constraints, operating conventions, and a business environment that competitively fuels the news networks. Even though we look to the news to set the norm, it is often the opposite that is covered. And even though the purpose of the news is to reflect a balanced interpretation of the events, bias and other constraints have shown that most stories in the news aren't balanced. With all of these influences that alter how an event is presented in the news, it is necessary to acquire the skills and knowledge to be media literate in today's world. Some of the most significant ways to become more media literate with the news content is to expose yourself to many different news sources. Getting information from several news networks allows you to form more useful opinions because you are able to get a balance of both sides of the event instead of just one side from one network. Another way to be more media literate is to be skeptical of the public opinion. Public opinion polls are often taken in ways that can create or change a person's real opinion on the event just by the way the question is primed. It's also important to be aware of journalist bias and the possibility of fabrication, which can easily imbalance a story. This concludes my presentation about today's news content and how it is interpreted by journalists and the importance of being media literate when assessing information from the news. Thank you.